Every dollar you spend at the gas pump right now is a direct receipt from a war that most American news anchors are still struggling to explain clearly. And the reason they can't explain it clearly is because they're looking at the wrong thing. They're watching the headlines about ceasefires and diplomatic talks and oil price charts going up and down. But if you step back, if you actually look at the architecture of what has unfolded across the Persian Gulf in just the last 18 months, what you see is something that goes far deeper than a regional conflict. What you are witnessing is the collapse of an economic assumption that has quietly underpinned the American standard of living for decades. The assumption that oil, Gulf oil specifically, would always flow, always be cheap, and always be available on the terms that Washington preferred. That assumption is now broken. And the $2 trillion in deals that Donald Trump flew to Riyadh, Doha, and Abu Dhabi to celebrate just a year ago? Those deals were supposed to lock in a new era of American dominance in the Gulf. Instead, what they actually did was help illuminate just how fragile the entire structure was, because the very Gulf states that signed those agreements with flags waving and fighter jets overhead are now watching their own energy infrastructure burn, their own LNG facilities go dark, and their own economies rattle in ways that none of the deal sheets from Trump's May 2025 tour ever accounted for. So let's start from the beginning, because to understand where we are today, you have to understand what Trump actually went to the Gulf to do and whether it worked. In May of 2025, Trump flew to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE on what his administration called a path-breaking diplomatic tour. Over 3 days, agreements valued at more than $2 trillion were announced across aviation, defense, technology, energy, and education. The White House declared it a massive success. Saudi Arabia pledged $600 billion in investments. Qatar announced a $1.2 trillion economic exchange. The UAE committed to hundreds of billions more. There were cavalry parades, Burj Khalifa lit up in American colors, a fleet of red Tesla Cybertrucks welcoming the American president in Doha, and a $400 million Boeing 747 gifted to Trump as a kind of updated Air Force One. The optics were extraordinary. The symbolism was unmistakable. America was back in the Gulf and America was winning. But here's the thing that serious analysts knew, even at the time, and that most of the mainstream coverage completely buried. Many of these deals were memorandums of understanding rather than legally binding contracts. Some of the deals touted as new had actually been announced months earlier. And during Trump's first term, he had similarly trumpeted a $450 billion package of Saudi deals, yet actual trade and investment flows between 2017 and 2020 amounted to less than $300 billion. So when the White House stood at the podium and said $2 trillion in great deals, the honest translation was something closer to $2 trillion in letters of intent, aspirational commitments, conditional pledges, and recycled announcements dressed up in fresh press releases. Now, none of this is unique to Trump. This is how Gulf diplomacy has always worked. Big numbers get announced, smaller numbers actually materialize. The real architecture of the relationship has never been about the dollar figures. It has always been about the underlying security guarantee, the implicit promise that American military power would protect Gulf oil flows, and in exchange, Gulf oil would be priced in dollars and flow reliably to global markets. That is the foundation. That is what everything else is built on. And that foundation is precisely what is now under enormous stress. China's shadow loomed over Trump's 2025 visit. In the intervening years since Trump's first term, Beijing had courted the Gulf aggressively. President Xi Jinping had received a red carpet welcome in Riyadh in 2022, and China's tech and infrastructure investments expanded across the Middle East. The Biden administration, trying to slow this, restricted exports of top-tier American chips to Gulf states out of fear they might leak to China. Trump reversed those restrictions, which was one of the main reasons Gulf monarchies were so willing to announce headline-grabbing investment numbers. They wanted access to American AI chips. They wanted to position themselves as technology hubs, and they were willing to hold up big dollar signs to get it. What they were not necessarily buying was unconditional American protection in a hot war, and that distinction matters enormously, because the war came. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran under an operation codenamed Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear sites, and leadership structures, resulting in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Iran responded with missile barrages on Israeli cities and American military bases across the Gulf, in the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain. The conflict expanded rapidly. Hezbollah launched rockets into Israel from Lebanon. The Houthis in Yemen re-entered the picture. And Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps moved to do the one thing that every Gulf expert had spent years hoping would never happen. They began closing the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the Strait of Hormuz is not just a body of water, it is the single most important maritime choke point on Earth for energy markets. Until the outbreak of this war, approximately 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas passed through it every single day. 20 million barrels of crude and refined products, 10 billion cubic feet of LNG every single day. When you close that strait, or even partially disrupt it, you are not just causing a price spike. You are triggering a cascade of consequences that hits fertilizer markets, food production, manufacturing supply chains, airline fuel supplies, and household energy bills simultaneously. And that is exactly what happened. Brent crude oil jumped from around $72 a barrel on February 27th to nearly $120 at its peak, surging more than 55% since the start of the war. March marked one of the largest monthly oil price jumps on record, with Brent gaining 51% as Gulf output fell and exports stalled. Wall Street analysts began openly discussing the possibility of oil at $200 a barrel if the strait stayed closed. And for the first time in a generation, that scenario, which had always been dismissed as doomsday fantasy, started to look like a realistic base case rather than a tail risk. Here is where the question about Trump's $2 trillion shield becomes central, because one of the largest line items in those May 2025 deals was a $142 billion arms package for Saudi Arabia, heralded by the White House as the largest defense sales agreement in American history. Missiles, radar systems, aircraft, electronic warfare capabilities. The explicit logic was that arming Saudi Arabia heavily would deter Iran, stabilize the Gulf, and protect energy flows. That was the strategic narrative being sold publicly. But now look at what actually happened when the war started. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline has capacity of 5 million barrels per day, but half of that capacity was already being used for regular pre-war deliveries, leaving only about 2.5 million barrels per day for potential bypass of the strait. And with 20 million barrels per day of Gulf oil exports effectively halted, Saudi Arabia, for all its American-purchased weapons, had no way to compensate for even a fraction of the shortfall. The arms deal didn't build a shield. It built the appearance of a shield, and that distinction between the appearance of security and actual security is the core lesson that the entire $2 trillion Gulf tour failed to address. The White House may never hit the $2 trillion figure cited during the trip. Some estimates place the total value at around $730 billion, since many of the deals signed were likely already in progress during the previous administration, and others are based on non-binding agreements. And even if every single dollar had materialized exactly as announced, none of it would have changed the fundamental vulnerability that the entire global energy system runs through a 21-mile wide stretch of water that a determined adversary can threaten with speedboats, sea mines, anti-ship missiles, and drones. Let's talk about what the energy shock actually looks like in American daily life, because this is the part that Washington power structures consistently fail to communicate honestly. The United States, buffered by domestic production, faced less direct impact than Europe and Asia, but still saw gasoline prices rise 5 to 10 cents per gallon daily in the early weeks of the conflict. That might sound modest, but when you compound it across weeks, when you add the downstream effects on diesel that trucks run on and jet fuel that airlines burn, what you get is inflationary pressure seeping into every single category of consumer spending. Food gets more expensive because trucks cost more to run. Flights get more expensive, heating costs jump. And this is happening against a backdrop where Bloomberg Economics data tracker placed U.S. consumer price inflation for March at 3.4% year over year, a marked increase from 2.4% in February, with rising fuel prices as the main driver. The fertilizer dimension is something almost nobody in American media is covering with the seriousness it deserves. Over 30% of global urea, which is widely used in agriculture and produced from natural gas, is exported from Gulf countries through the Strait of Hormuz. Urea is nitrogen fertilizer. Without it, crop yields collapse. The price of growing corn, wheat, and soybean spikes, and that price spike travels directly to grocery store shelves within 1 to 2 growing seasons. We are talking about a structural food inflation dynamic that is not a temporary price blip. It is a multi-year repricing of basic agricultural inputs. The British think tank that monitors food policy has already warned of long-term food price increases as a consequence of this disruption. And yet, the connection between a closed strait in the Persian Gulf and the price of bread in Ohio is not being drawn clearly enough in most American conversations. Now, there is a deeper geopolitical layer here that deserves serious attention. The war itself, the February 28th strikes on Iran, the assassination of Khamenei, the cascade of missile exchanges did not come from nowhere. Tensions between Iran, the United States, and Israel had escalated in the lead-up to 2026, stemming from failed nuclear negotiations in Geneva and a prior 12-day air conflict in 2025. There had already been a warning shot, there had already been a preliminary military engagement, and the diplomatic track had broken down completely. What the $2 trillion tour in May 2025 did not do, what it could not do by its own design, was resolve the fundamental contradiction between America's strategic commitment to Israel's security and the Gulf states' complex relationship with Iran as a regional neighbor they must ultimately coexist with. Saudi Arabia, for all the arms purchases and investment pledges, has its own interests that do not perfectly align with Washington's. After decades of efforts at economic diversification, the Gulf Cooperation Council states had finally seen significant and promising non-oil growth, even amid sustained low oil prices. The IMF estimated non-oil GDP growth in the GCC at an average of 3.7% in 2024, rising slightly to 3.8% in 2025. These countries were in the middle of genuine transformation. Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, the AI and technology hubs in the UAE, the LNG expansion in Qatar, all of it required stability, foreign investment confidence, and a Gulf that tourists and tech entrepreneurs felt safe flying into. The war has shattered that narrative. The conflict has been described as the end of the narrative that the Gulf is a permanently safe destination for expatriates, immigrants, and tourists, with suggestions that the war has irreversibly shaken the region's image, exposing deep-seated fragility beneath the facade of rapid economic transformation. Think about what that means for a country like Qatar, which had just signed a $1.2 trillion economic exchange with the United States 9 months before Iranian missiles struck its LNG infrastructure. On March 18th, Iran struck Qatar's Ras Laffan Industrial City LNG complex, causing a 17% reduction in Qatar's LNG production capacity, with damages estimated to take 3 to 5 years to repair. Qatar's LNG exports are not peripheral to the global energy system, they are central to it. The war precipitated a second major energy crisis for Europe, primarily through the suspension of Qatari LNG, coinciding with historically low European gas storage levels, estimated at just 30% capacity following a harsh winter, causing European gas benchmark prices to nearly double. This is the interconnected fragility that the $2 trillion framework completely obscured. The deals were structured as if the Gulf were a stable platform onto which American investment could safely land. But the Gulf was never as stable as the deal sheets implied. It was a region held together by a security equilibrium that had been degrading for years, corroded by maximum pressure campaigns on Iran, by failed nuclear diplomacy, by proxy conflicts in Yemen and Syria, by the unresolved Palestinian question, and by the gradual hollowing out of American credibility as the reliable security guarantor of last resort. And here is the moral dimension that deserves to be stated plainly. When American policymakers sell $142 billion in weapons to Saudi Arabia and describe it as a shield for Gulf security, they are also making a claim about the moral architecture of the global order, the claim that American arms equal American protection, equal regional stability, but the war has exposed that claim as incomplete at best and dishonest at worst. The weapons sold did not prevent the war. The investments announced did not create the structural security that investment requires to flourish, and the American people, who will pay higher gas prices, higher food prices, and higher inflation costs as a consequence of this conflict, were never fully included in the conversation about whether this approach was the right one. The deeper strategic lesson here is about the difference between transactional power and structural power, and more precisely, the distinction between short-term deal-making power and long-term system-shaping power. Trump's approach to the Gulf was fundamentally transactional, built around immediate exchanges and visible deals rather than deeper institutional design. Show up, announce big numbers, take credit for deals, fly home, and repeat that cycle as the central method of engagement. The implicit assumption was that transactions create relationships, and relationships create stability, and that repeated deal-making naturally compounds into durable order. But structural power is something different, something deeper and slower, and it is the capacity to shape the underlying conditions, the diplomacy, the deterrence architecture, the conflict resolution mechanisms, that determine whether or not wars start in the first place, rather than simply responding once they do. The Trump administration was extraordinarily good at transactional performance, highly effective in the optics and mechanics of deal announcements and visible outcomes. The May 2025 tour was a masterclass in it, a concentrated demonstration of that style of diplomacy in its most refined form. But transactional success and structural security are not the same thing, and they do not automatically translate into one another, even if they sometimes appear connected on the surface. And the Strait of Hormuz crisis of 2026 is the proof, the concrete and material evidence of that gap between performance and structure. What does this mean going forward, and what does it imply for the trajectory ahead? Because this is ultimately what matters for Americans trying to understand where we are headed and how the system is likely to behave under continued stress. US government officials and Wall Street analysts have begun openly discussing the prospect that oil prices might surge to $200 a barrel if the strait remains closed for an extended period, and that projection is being treated increasingly as a serious scenario rather than a remote one. Even if the conflict de-escalates, and there are fragile signs that some form of negotiated pause may be possible, however limited and temporary it may be, the structural damage has already been done in a way that cannot simply be reversed. The world has seen in real time and without ambiguity exactly how vulnerable the global oil and gas system is to a determined regional adversary with mines, drones, and missiles, and how quickly that vulnerability can be exposed. That knowledge does not disappear when a ceasefire is signed or when fighting slows down. It gets priced in permanently, embedded into expectations, models, and risk calculations across the global economy. Insurance rates for shipping through the Gulf will never fully return to pre-war levels, even if calm technically returns. Investment confidence in Gulf economic diversification projects has taken a hit that will take years to rebuild, and that recovery will be slow and uneven. And the geopolitical landscape, the balance of power between the United States, China, Russia, Iran, and the Gulf monarchies, has shifted in ways that are still being calculated, still being absorbed, and still being adjusted to in real time. China's position in all of this is worth dwelling on carefully and worth examining slowly rather than quickly. Trump's Gulf tour was explicitly understood as a response to China's strategic foothold in the Gulf through its Belt and Road Initiative, with Beijing stepping up concrete investments in infrastructure, energy, and logistics across the region in a sustained and deliberate way. The irony is that the war, which the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign on Iran helped accelerate in its broader trajectory, has actually created conditions that could benefit Beijing strategically in the longer run. Amid global oil and gas disruptions, China, which had been preparing its energy infrastructure for exactly this kind of disruption and volatility, stands positioned to benefit from the electrostate era of energy independence, while Western economies scramble to adjust under pressure. China has been building out its own energy security architecture, domestic renewables, strategic petroleum reserves, LNG import diversification, and long-term energy contracts with non-Gulf producers, precisely because Beijing understood that the Gulf was not a permanently stable platform and should not be treated as one. That long-term preparation now intersects with current instability in a way that reinforces China's relative resilience. America needs to ask itself a very uncomfortable question, and it is a question that cannot be avoided by rhetoric or short-term framing. If the $2 trillion shield did not provide real security, and if the maximum pressure approach to Iran did not produce a negotiated settlement, but instead produced a hot war with historic oil price consequences, then what exactly was the strategy in its actual operational form, and who is accountable for the gap between the triumphant press conferences and the current reality on the ground and in global markets? These are not partisan questions, and they are not reducible to political preference or narrative framing. They are structural ones, rooted in how policy actually functions over time.